I think we should get started now. Thank you very much for joining today's CGD seminar. I'm Jiang Zhu, host of today's seminar. It's my great pleasure to introduce our own Adrianna Foster. Today, she will be presenting Tracking Shifts and Uncertainty in Global Climate Space. And Adrianna is a forest ecologist and ecological modeler whose work focuses on high-resolution modeling of forest ecosystems, remote sensing of vegetation structure and stress, and disturbance vegetation climate interactions. Adrianna got her PhD from the University of Virginia and completed postdoc research at NASA Goddard Space Flight Center and Northern Arizona University. She joined NCAR in 2021, where she is now a scientist in the terrestrial sciences section. Her recent work centers on developing and applying the phase cohort model within the community terrestrial system model to understand how forests respond to a changing climate. A reminder, during the seminar, please hold your questions to the Q&A session at the end of the talk. For those watching on YouTube, you can submit your questions via Slido. Simply go to slido.com and join using the code CGD seminar. Okay, Adrianna, the floor is yours.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, so thanks. This is kind of a side project I've been working on, so I'm interested in feedback maybe at the end. But and so yeah, though I am only going to be showing climate data, this is an ecology-centered talk. So we're going to try to thread that needle. But so as an ecologist, I really want to understand, how do ecosystems change when climate changes? And so I want to first start by walking us through the historical roots of this question. So how early ecologists tried to connect vegetation to climate. And I'll introduce this Holdridge Life Zone system, which I'll be using, and then what it captures. And then I'll show how we can use these life zones to think about modern climate change scenarios, and then what that implies for vegetation distributions. But first, I'd like to acknowledge the co-collaborators for this project, Gordon Bonin, Will Weeder, Linnea Hawkins, Isla Simpson, and Dave Lawrence. They've been really helpful in formulating the methods and sort of analyses of this project. And then I also want to thank my PhD advisor, Hank Schugert, who kind of inspired the idea for this project. And he might or may not be online, but I don't know. Okay, so this question about how ecosystems change when climate changes, it's really relevant today, obviously, but it also is an extremely old question. So as early as the 3rd century BC, Theophrastus was a Greek philosopher. He conducted ecological experiments. He transplanted plant species outside of their natural ranges to see if and how they would grow. He liked documenting changes in phenology, how the relationship between altitude and latitude and climate and vegetation played out. Alexander von Humboldt was an ecologist in the early 19th century, was devoted to the detailed measurement of the planet with the goal of understanding how physical and biological processes shape and sustain the world. And so one of his publications included this schematic of a cross-section through the equatorial Andes. This is Mount Chimborazo. So here you can't see it, but plant species are listed according to the altitude at which you can find them. Well, he found them in his expedition to Ecuador. And he documented these changes in the distribution of vegetation based on changing precipitation, temperature, and other environmental variables as those were affected by altitude. And so this led him to develop the concept of isothermal lines. So that was Humboldt's invention. So these are lines that connect locations with the same annual average temperature. And so he saw that these captured things like regular variations in the height of snow on mountains, vegetation, like tree lines, and then as those changed with elevation and altitude. And so since these early efforts in what we might call biogeography, studies evolved to an interest in how climate and other variables shaped vegetation globally. And so we wanted to know, how did climate control the distributions of species, the types of vegetation, so essentially what today we would call biomes. And so in 1872, Grisebach developed the first global vegetation map. It showed several biomes with similar physical appearance, like tropical rainforest and prairies, but occurring sort of all over the globe. But then there were also very specific groupings like Australian flora. And so he based these maps on extremely detailed accounts of species in different regions. And then in 1898, Schimper developed the first vegetation map with sort of modern biomes like savannas, tropical forests, and needle-leaf forests. And these were more based on just the physical characteristics as opposed to just like the physical characteristics and their location. So we were starting to see that there were these large-scale boundaries of vegetation that followed mapped patterns of climatic variables. Merriam was another scientist. He worked in the western US at the turn of the 20th century on the distribution of plants and animals. He initially focused his work on altitudinal gradients in the San Francisco peaks in northern Arizona. So similar to Alexander von Humboldt, he emphasized temperature as this focal variable that controlled the distribution of plants. And for both scientists, this temperature was synthesizing the interactions between natural systems and the environment. And then Merriam later went on to make direct comparisons between the biomes that you could find in the San Francisco peaks to global sort of continental distributions of equivalent vegetation types as controlled by temperature. Okay, so then in 1967, this guy Holdridge developed the Holdridge Life Zone system, which relates climate and vegetation zones, which he called life zones, using indices of 3 different climate variables, so temperature, precipitation, and potential evapotranspiration ratio, which is basically aridity. And so this system has been used to evaluate regional and global vegetation patterns using quantitative measures of climatic conditions. And it's nice because you can use observational data to create, if you wanted to make a map, you could use observational data. And this, you could see this as an improvement on the previous approaches with the addition of these 2 additional climate variables. So kind of what we have been talking about from an ecological and biogeography perspective, from a climate science perspective, we might call climate space. So when I say climate space, I mean that is some multidimensional set of climate conditions that describe a location on the globe, particularly as it relates to vegetation or animals, depending on what you're interested in. So here we have some measure of performance of some species, and then as it relates to temperature, and really in space. So temperature in space, so we can range from warmer, so at the equator or lower elevation, to colder, which is polewards or at higher elevation. And then there's some optimal temperature for this species. And then across multiple climate dimensions, we could see this as sort of a climate envelope where this species ideally can grow. And then if we look spatially, we might see a distribution of this species across some climate gradient. So then what happens if we get a change in climate? Well, that optimum temperature has now shifted in space. And then similarly for our 2D climate, we get this contraction in gray where it's no longer suitable for that species, and maybe an expansion in darker green where new areas become more suitable. And so then if we look at the landscape, we now get this shift in temperature. That species might move, and we might get expansion into new areas, and then it no longer exists in this old area, and then we might even see invasion of a new species. So yeah, this idea of climate space applies to all biota, but for this talk, I'm going to focus on vegetation. And what happens to vegetation is important, not only because of its influence on climate, but also for their role in ecosystem services like providing habitat, lumber, crops, and even flood mitigation. And so in the face of changing climate, we have seen plant species migration in the past. So for example, this is a map showing the current distribution of jack pine in gray, and then it's superimposed on the Laurentide ice sheet in blue. at the last glacial maximum. And these red dots are fossil locations of jack pine. And we can see these sort of dotted lines are what we sort of like implied or inferred migration rates. And so here, this study estimated jack pine migrated about 19 kilometers per century as a result of the changing climate. More recently, in northern New Mexico in the 1950s, the ecotone between semi-arid ponderosa pine and pinyon juniper woodland shifted extensively through mortality of the ponderosa pine in response to a severe drought. And then currently, we are seeing evidence of biome shifts in the boreal zone. So here is an image of a white spruce tree moving into the tundra. So this is evidence of northern tree line expansion. And then here we can see boreal browning in southern Canada, so evidence for southern boreal contraction. And these biome shifts can have important feedbacks on climate. So for example, we know that evergreen forests have a lower albedo than do deciduous forests. And then in contrast, we know that forest cover has a lower albedo than tundra. So this northern tree line change or boreal contraction is going to have a major impact on climate. Similarly, if we compare forest and grassland, forests tend to have a lower albedo, larger surface roughness, higher latent sensible heat fluxes, and these all lead to differences in temperature, mixing of air, and convective rainfall. And then globally, biome shifts have been identified by several studies as potential climate tipping points. So understanding where these biome shifts may occur, how quickly, and any uncertainty associated with these shifts is important, both from an ecosystem services and a climate perspective. So my goal here is to quantify potential shifts in biomes and climate space using this Holdridge Life Zones that I covered previously as a structured framework. And so just to go dive into this a little bit more, so the idea is to treat Holdridge Life Zones as kind of climate space or climate envelope, as well as a classification system. So this system relies on 3 different climate variables. So biotemperature, which is a little different than annual temperature. It's basically just average annual temperature, except we cap the temperature from 0 to 30 degrees. So it's going to be a little different than regular annual temperature. Average annual precipitation, and then aridity index, which is potential evapotranspiration over precipitation. And so we can see our climate space as this 3D vector of biotemperature, precipitation, and aridity. And actually, if you'll notice on this triangle, those values are log2 scaled. So it's just this 3D vector of log2 scaled climate variables. Okay, so for this project, I wanted to apply this framework to the CESM2 large ensemble, which allows for quantification of uncertainty in the climate space and biome projections due to internal climate variability. So for this project, I used 90 ensemble members from the CESM2 lens. The first 10 didn't have enough data, or high frequency enough data. And so this would result in 90 different Holdridge Life Zone classifications for each simulation year. And as I said, other studies have used this framework, and there are a few recently that used it to look at climate projections. But this use of the lens provides an advantage because it adds that uncertainty component. And so we have that additional insight into uncertainty and probability just due to internal sort of inherent uncertainty. Okay, and so for each grid cell of each ensemble member, for each simulation year, I classified the Holdridge Life Zone by minimizing the Euclidean distance to these centroids. So each of these hexagons, you can imagine that it has some centroid value of the 3 variables. And so for each grid cell, if I just know what's the closest one, that's how it gets classified. For the PET, because the aridity needs PET, I calculated that using the Penman-Monteith formulation. There's other ways to calculate this. Originally, Holdridge just used it as a ratio of biotemperature times some scalar divided by precip. So there's different methods you could go about it, but currently I'm using Penman-Monteith. And then there's another little quirk. If you'll notice, this warm temperate and subtropical, they actually have the same climate values. They're just differentiated based on the frost line. So warm temperate life zones are allowed to have frost days, and subtropical do not have any frost days. So that's just the difference there. Okay, and so then because these classifications are basically qualitative, and generally you're supposed to use them based on longer term climate conditions. I wanted to minimize sort of wiggling along transition zones due to interannual variability. So I classified the zones based on 10-year rolling averages of CESM output. And so I did this from 1855 to 2095 for 90 members. And so if you're not familiar with the lens, the future period is using SSP 3.7, which is kind of a relatively high emissions pathway. And so I also included, I'm going to include some results from another large ensemble, though much smaller. It's only 16 ensemble members using SSP 245. And then for good measure, I threw in SSP 585. Okay, so for the climate space analysis, as I said, we can think of our climate space as this 3D vector of log2 transformed biotemperature, precip, and aridity. And then if we take the slopes of each of these across a time series, we get a 3D slope vector. And then the Euclidean sum of this slope vector can be sort of thought of as a kind of climate trend. I was originally calling this climate speed, but that means something completely different, and there's already a climate speed literature out there. But anyway, this variable is directionless because they're squared. It's also basically unitless, but essentially it represents a kind of climatological and ecological pressure to migrate or adapt. And a value of 1 of this climate trend over time, so if you take like 1, the trend or the rate times the number of years, that value, if it's 1, that means you've moved like 1 whole hexagon on the triangle. Okay, so here is the classification using, this is just using the ensemble average, just so we can actually look at a map. For year 2000 on the top and 2100, you can kind of squint and see that there are differences, but this is 38 zones, so it's pretty difficult to see differences. And so like some other studies, I grouped these zones into 13 sort of aggregate zones, or I'm calling them collapsed zones. And so we have, again, polar desert, tundra, boreal desert and boreal forest, steppe and cool temperate forest, warm temperate forest and desert, chaparral and subtropical forest, and then tropical desert, tropical dry forest, and tropical forest. Okay, so here is that same map, but with the aggregated the collapse zones. So here you can kind of much more easily see some broad changes in life zone categorization. So for example, in the high latitudes, you can see at the top we had boreal and tundra. The boreal is moving into the tundra, and we've got cool temperate moving into the boreal forest. We're seeing a similar dynamic occur in the Tibetan Plateau. In southern Canada, we're seeing shift upwards in warm temperate desert and steppe. And in Europe and the northeast US, we see warm temperate forest replacing cool temperate forest. And then in the tropics, we see some shift from subtropical to tropical forest and tropical forest to dry tropical forest. And then here's looking at, so that was for SSP 3.7. Here's looking at on the left, you can see the same thing for 2.4.5 and 5.8.5. Essentially, 2.4.5 is just a less extreme version, although actually the boreal the tundra shift is actually pretty similar, but between 2.4.5 and 3.7. And then 5.8.5 is just a really extreme. So we can also think about, because those were ensemble averages, but of course I calculated the life zones for each ensemble member. And so we can kind of think about, okay, what's the probability of a life zone shift from year 2000 to 2100? And so here's what that represents. And so we can see broad areas of 100% agreement. There's going to be a life zone shift in yellow, and then 100% agreement that there isn't going to be a life zone shift in blue in the tropics, which is kind of interesting. So yeah, let's talk about that. So these no change areas, if you'll remember, this triangle is built using biotemperature, which is an annual temperature capped at 30 degrees, meaning that if a grid cell is like maybe slightly less than 30 degrees, or even it's just above 24 degrees, and then we move above 30 degrees, it's going to stay the same, essentially. There's no change, right? But that's not real. There is a change. Well, maybe. So this is looking at year 2100. So this is, I don't know if this is year 2100, but this is a map of biotemperature. This is a map of annual temperature at year 2100. And those really dark red areas are all areas that have an annual temperature above 30 degrees. And so when Holdridge developed this system in the 1960s, he used this biotemperature because he thought plants can't survive at annual temperatures above 30 degrees C. And actually, there weren't many areas of the globe that were above that value. Right, so yeah, if we have, we're in these values that exist, they're sort of off this triangle. And here's proportion of the land exceeding 30 degrees C for the 3 different scenarios. So up until about 1975, it was hovering around, I don't know if that's like 2%, and then it ramps up pretty significantly, 15 to 35%, depending on which scenario you go with. And here is looking at the probability of exceeding 30 degrees C in 2100. So it's a large area of the globe. So for this triangle, it doesn't really fit our purpose in the Anthropocene anymore. So I added some new life zones. I actually just did this yesterday, so anyway. All right, so I'm calling these super tropical named, maybe we don't like that name, but anyway. So we've got super tropical desert, super tropical dry forest, and super tropical forest. Okay, so these are basically the same, and because it's a log2 system, I just extended the same rate out. So hopefully this is sound. Okay, so here are those same maps. In 2000, we don't really see any of those fancy new life zones, but in 2100, we see a lot of them. So here, can you see? Yes, here is this super tropical desert. This is super tropical dry forest. And then India is, which previously was like no change at all. Now it's like completely changed. Okay, so here's our new probability of zone change. Much more of the tropics now is changed. And so we can think about certain change versus stable no change as like a probability kind of qualitative value. So I'm saying certain change is if 90% or more of the ensemble agrees that a life zone will change, then it's certain. And if less than 10% agree that a life zone will change, I'm calling it stable. And then in the middle is some kind of like uncertain. We're not sure. Okay, so for this, this is looking at the collapsed zones. So this is saying that 42% of the land is projected to change with more than 90% of ensemble agreement, but then 25% is projected not to change with 90% agreement, essentially. And then there's some in the middle where 32% of it we're not sure. And then you can kind of flip back and forth between if we have more life zones, more of them are going to change because there's just more to do. So you can decide whether or not we like all of the zones, which is like 30 some versus just 15. Okay, so here's looking at SSP 37 in the middle and then 245 on the top and 585. Again, it's just getting more extreme as we have the higher emission scenarios. So we can also look at net total land area change across. So if we sum up the land area for each of these life zones, we can look at historical, which I'm calling, or contemporary, which is year 2000, and then SSP 245, 370, and 585 and 2100. And so we can see that tundra decreases pretty significantly across all of the SSPs, which without much difference. Oh, and these error bars, so this is the mean of across all the ensembles, and the error bars are the 95% confidence interval, the 95% percentile on that, not the confidence interval. The boreal forest actually has it declines in all scenarios, but there's a pretty strong difference between the 3 different SSPs, so that's nice to see. Steppe, which is the sort of cool temperate desert, also decreases, but then we get an increase in cool temperate forest, mostly increase in warm temperate forest and desert. And then what's interesting is that now with these new life zones, we used to have no change in the tropics, but now we're getting a decline in tropics and an increase sort of where there was never this life zone before. Now we've got these super tropical life zones that are appearing. Okay, so we can look at this over time. So again, this is the mean total land area. So this is kind of like the net change that we're looking at. In the tundra, and these maps here, you can see the red is what I'm calling a contraction, so where the biome existed in year 2000. and does not exist anymore in 2100. The blue is where it is stable, so it exists both in 2000 and 2100, and the green is expansion. So it didn't exist in 2000, and now it does in 2100. So we can see the tundra moving northward. Similarly, the boreal biomes are moving northward, but they're also contracting more than they are expanding. And then here, just more interesting, we're looking at the tropics. So these used to be sort of flat before I added those life zones. Now they're actually flat, and then they start to decline, but a lot later than the others. So like the tundra ones, we can see that actually started to decline around 1975, but this takes until much later. So that's kind of interesting. And then here's our new supertropical. So those are increasing starting around, I think, around now, like 2025. Okay, and then just looking across SSPs, as I said, so tundra doesn't really change at all, depending on what emission scenario, so that maybe that's scary. But we have a lot of opportunity to save the boreal forest if we stick to 245. So that's nice. And then similarly for the tropical biomes, these ones that are shifting to the supertropical, we have a lot of opportunity to not have those disappear, depending on the emission scenario. Okay, so this was just the net change, right? But that doesn't mean that life zones aren't changing within that. You can imagine, like, you know, tropics, some other grid cells are becoming tropics, and those tropics are going into supertropics. So this is just the net change, but there's a lot more going on. So this is the transition matrix, and this is transition probability across the whole ensemble. And so this is kind of crazy to look at, but here is the one-to-one line, so that means no change. This is one hexagon warmer, so we've got a lot of grid cells that are going one hexagon warmer. So basically, it's the probability if you're a subtropical desert scrub, what is your most probable transition? Is it going to be the same, or is it going to be slightly warmer? And then out here is like 2 hexagons warmer. That's way, way warmer. This is another way of looking at the same data. So this is the area-weighted change in life zone. So from the left, which is year 2000, to the right, which is 2100. And if you look at this, about 55% of the landscape transitions in scenario 3.7. And so we can see a lot of interesting things going on. So tundra, some of it is staying the same, but then a lot of them are moving to boreal forest. And in the boreal forest, a lot of them are moving to cool temperate forest, but some are moving into steppe, which is cool temperate desert, essentially. And then our steppe is going a lot of places. So, I mean, you can stare at, I feel like you could stare at this a long time, but it reveals a lot. A lot is actually going on. And then here's just looking at the same graphs across all the different scenarios. So we just get more transition with higher emission scenarios. Okay, so and then I want to relate this back to climate space trend. So this is that climate space change, so that 3D slope, the Euclidean sum of the 3D slope vector. And so I'm capping it, the bar at 1. So 1 is essentially one whole hexagon. So we can see that we do have a lot of the areas of the globe in SSP 3.7 that are at or above 1. So namely the northern, the high latitudes, and then also some dry areas. But then there's some areas that maybe don't change as much. So, and this is nice to look at because even though there could be an area where maybe your life zone doesn't completely change from life zone 1 to life zone 2, but your climate space is still changing slightly or more than slightly. And so there's still going to be some ecological pressure to move even if you don't change one whole life zone. And so we can and this is looking at the climate speed, the signal to noise. And so this is like a very strong signal. So there's no area of the globe where the signal to noise is less than 1. We can decompose this into our different trends. So this is biotemperature change. Again, here it's even stronger, very, very strong signal of annual temperature increase. That's no surprise. And then here is precipitation. So we see areas where we're getting a decline in precip and in areas where we're getting an increases in precipitation. And here is where it gets kind of interesting, because there are areas of the globe where the signal to noise ratio is less than 1. So we are seeing some uncertainty in the precipitation trend, which I know is not news to people who studied the CESM lens. But and similarly with aridity, we're getting areas where we do have uncertainty. And I think this part is what was most interesting to me. So this is looking at the annual precipitation change, so over the 100 years. And the top one is the 95th percentile, and the bottom is the 5th. And so obviously the top is higher and the bottom is lower. But what I think is interesting is that there are areas of the globe where it crosses the 0 line. So there are areas where we're not sure if it's going to be an increase or a decrease in precipitation. And same with aridity. And so what that means for our sites, and also the rate of change is also different. And so even if it's going to be a net positive, it's faster in some ensemble members and slower in others. And so you can pull out a single site. And so this is looking at Brooks Range, Alaska. So that was where there's ongoing studies looking at white spruce tree line migration. Here's looking at, from the life zone classification, here is actually showing it's already shifted to boreal mostly, but it definitely does it by 2045. We can look back in time and see that it actually was kind of always on the edge, but it was mostly classified as tundra. But now, starting in about the late 90s, we're moving more towards, all the ensemble members agree, or almost all of them agree, that it's boreal. And that actually tracks with what we've seen. We're seeing seedlings here, or saplings here now, which means that they sort of have started from a while ago. Here's looking at Toolik Lake, Alaska. So now it's mostly tundra, but maybe by 2030 it's going to be a boreal site. Here's looking at a black spruce site in Canada. If you remember, there's boreal browning going on in southern Canada. This is actually in Manitoba, but we're seeing that now it's classified as boreal, but then in the future it's maybe uncertain. I mean, it's mostly classified as this steppe, which is like cool temperate desert, but there's also some cool temperate forest in there in the green. And so we're seeing that there's some uncertainty in the precip, at least as it in 2045. Here we can look at northern Australia. Here's a more clear example of uncertainty in the aridity and precipitation direction. So before it was a dry tropical forest, it's moving into desert, but it's unclear if it's going to be like a desert or slightly less deserty desert. And then it's the last one. This one is in northern Botswana. And so here, up until the very end, we are getting this sort of like uncertainty with respect to moisture. And so we can look at the climate variables over time for this site. So here's annual temperature, and that's the darker shading is the 25 to 75th percentile, and the light is the 10th to 90th. And so for the annual temperature, it's a very strong signal. We're going way up, and we even get over 30 degrees. But the precip and the aridity is where it kind of gets interesting. And these lines are the Holdridge Life Zone sort of delineations. And so we're very clearly moving into a new temperature zone, but our precipitation and aridity zones are kind of more uncertain. Like a good portion of the ensemble, we can't really decide which one we're in. And you can decide whether that is meaningful or not. I mean, these are just maybe arbitrarily defined values, but it is pretty interesting. Okay, so we're going to get change, right? Change is coming. Change is definitely coming, right? But maybe we're uncertain in which direction in terms of aridity and precipitation, but change is definitely coming. And so if you're a plant species living in some area, you're going to experience change. And so, time's up for you, but maybe your offspring can survive somehow. And so we can think about what is the potential for species migration with time. And so we can look at what I did was I took a grid cell, let's say here. This is, here we're at boreal. What's in 2100, so in 2000, if we're classified as a boreal zone, what's the closest grid cell that is the same life zone as I am now in 2100? And then you can use that to sort of estimate required species migration per year. So that's what this map is for SSP 37. And so I'm going all the way up to 1,000, which is sort of like what we think is like the maximum rate of plant species migration per a kilometer per century. But really, that's like pretty generous. It's probably more like 100, which is kind of bleak. But so the yellow areas are, we probably won't be able to migrate there. But then, and the blue areas are no migration required. So you can kind of see where in the globe migration is required either the fastest or it's just kind of probably going to be impossible. And so on that note, this big study in the boreal zone where they were actually like walking along the whole Brooks Range cataloging saplings, he estimated this as very fast rate, 40 kilometers per century. Compared to our map, that's actually like slow, unfortunately, right? But we, okay, so species migration, right, it depends on not just on climate suitability, right, but also seed dispersal, substrate quality, and plant competition. And so this study in 1993 took inventory of documented species migration rates at kilometers per century and found that there are some, like 10% of the species had 1,000 kilometers per century, but the dominant one was like 100. And so, I don't know, that's a little scary. But, okay, so what does this all mean? So we have strong pressure to migrate or adapt. That could happen too. And the strongest push seems to be in the northern latitudes and drylands. The annual temperature sort of meant that we were sort of off the chart. We need to create new life zones to accommodate temperatures above 30 degrees Celsius. And in general, we're seeing that the climate space is moving faster than the species generally could migrate into it. And then we are seeing uncertainty in aridity and precipitation. And so what does this mean for ecosystems? Well, we're probably going to see range shifts. We're already seeing range shifts now, so that's probably going to increase in the future. This could result in increased disturbance, so fire, insect outbreaks, drought or dieback, and invasive species. And then we're definitely going to have, climate feedbacks because of all of these changes. For Earth system modeling, I feel strongly that the Earth system models need to model these vegetation shifts prognostically. So this includes competition, climate feedbacks, maybe even seed dispersal. That's a lot harder. Just to show an example of why this is important. So a recent study by Summers et al. Looked at retreat of the Greenland ice sheet. And they did it under two scenarios where they had sort of dynamic vegetation as employed by a DGVM, and then static vegetation based on pre-industrial conditions, and the results were quite different. So the changes in the ice sheet response requires really good vegetation distributions. So if we want to understand how the climate is going to change in the future, we really do need to get these vegetation distributions right. And like I said, I don't think we can just say, oh, well, the boreal zone is moving here based on the climate envelope, so let's put boreal forest here, because we know that they can't migrate that fast. And so we really do need dynamic models to get this right. Just to cover some limitations, so this biotemperature cap, if you don't include the new life zones, it probably definitely underestimates tropical changes. I mean, maybe the trees will be fine. But there's also a coarse spatial resolution, so it's likely to miss climate refugia, which a lot of people talk about. There's no wind speed effect, so we're missing the cause of alpine tundra. In Holdridge Life Zones, it's just based on cold temperature, which we know is not true. And then again, these migration assumptions don't capture seed dispersal, soil conditions, and competition. And so in the future, I would really like to dive more into the uncertainty analysis. So I want to focus on the probability of life zone transitions or the timing of them, maybe do more site level analyses, and some questions. Should we be using the smooth climate for these life zone classifications, because we're kind of getting rid of some of the variability? And then if we are going to use smooth climate, what's the time period for that? Should I be creating these new life zones? And then at least for like maybe a paper, like should I use the collapsed or the full life zones? Okay, so yeah, climate space is predicted to shift rapidly, at least according to our CESM ensemble. Many ecosystems are projected to require migration rates far above what most species have historically achieved. And that uncertainty in the precip and aridity means that while change is coming, What will come is potentially unknown. So that, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Adrianna, for the excellent talk and also a bit scary. Okay, we have time to take questions. Let's start with one in the room. Katie?
How much do you think the choice of Holdridge mapped onto your results, especially the point you made about wind and the temperature cap?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of, yeah, I think it is everything, right? Like that's, I don't know of anyone that uses wind. I mean, we use Whitaker biomes, which is actually maybe even less, like it's a little, like it uses fewer variables and is more coarse. So I don't know. I mean, if someone knows of another system, I would be interested. But yeah, I think the wind speed is interesting for sure. And they're annual, right? So like we know there's a huge signal in the annual temperature, but what about wintertime temperatures? What about, there's a lot of other climate, obviously a lot of other climate variables that that you could use that are, that definitely affect plant species.
Do we have a question on Slido?
Sure, yeah.
Okay.
Sorry.
This question, maybe I start with.
Oh.
Okay.
Uh-oh.
Yeah, because I saw Ali's question first.
Oh, okay.
So great work. I wonder, could be any nonlinearity in biome change? For instance, can a biome be disappeared or jump couple of steps in biome due to wildfire or diseases?
Yeah, I mean, for sure. This wouldn't cover that because it's just looking at the climate envelope. It's not actually looking at real modeled vegetation change. I mean, we are certainly seeing that, at least in the boreal zone, we're seeing that wildfire can initiate a shift because it's harder for when a fire comes in, the seedlings and saplings can fail. We get failed regeneration or a shift from black spruce to deciduous, and so certainly like disturbance is really important for maybe accelerating these shifts.
Let's take one question in the room. Summer?
This is excellent presentation. So when climate shifts, I presume that the species would first try to adjust or adapt. So in terms of time frame, I mean, before they decide to migrate, what's the time frame? For example, by 2030, would one species try to be adjusting in one region before it says that, okay, let's move northward?
Yeah, I mean, I think both would probably, I mean, they're not like, if your plants are sessile, right? So like if you're a tree, you can't move. Like the only thing you can do is adapt or die, right? So from an individual perspective, you either adapt or you die. From a population perspective, you can adapt or migrate, right? And so I think probably both would be going on. And I don't know. This is what came up in some of our a group meeting with the collaborators, is that how long can plants survive in a biome that is like not suitable to them? And I don't know, like I think people have definitely tried to do that, and there's these common garden experiments where they, and even like what Theophrastus was doing this in the 3rd century BC, he was planting species outside of their range. How can you grow? And I think there's not necessarily an understanding of like, boreal trees can last for 10 years outside their range. I think that's why I'm saying we need these dynamic vegetation models to actually simulate this for us. And that would be able, then we would be able to bring in these things like wildfire and insect out. Well, we don't have insect outbreaks, but we could add insect outbreaks and things like that. So, I mean, that's a great question for sure.
Next, let's take the question from Eric. The plots about area of a globe exceeding 30 degrees C seem a bit alarming to me, the super life zones. I assume that plants may still survive there, but maybe at reduced biomass. But at some temperature, plants just won't be able to survive, right? Does that mean deserts? And do deserts increase?
Yeah, I think the common thing is they can't die at 40 degrees C. So we could look at, I mean, you could use this and look at probability of 40 degrees C happening. And then if that happens, then sorry, you're a desert now. But yeah, I agree. Like that climate envelope just sort of gives you a climate pressure or ecological pressure to either adapt or migrate. And we're not necessarily saying that we're going to have a disappearance of a tropical zone, but it's sort of that your climate envelope has shifted completely. And so as a plant, what is going to happen to you is, maybe unknown, but yeah.
Okay, from the back.
Question is, in reality, you have these places where you have contraction and there's no corresponding expansion because of the rates are not suitable. Can you tell us what you think those landscapes are going to look like?
Yeah, we're seeing a lot of grassland conversion. So if it's a forest, we're converting to grassland if we get regeneration failure, especially in Canada, in southern Canada. And there's an area I'm like very boreal focused, but there's the Kenai Peninsula, had a bunch of fires a while ago, and then has completely failed to come back as a forest. It's now grassland. And so that is and then we're seeing desertification in some areas. So maybe it was shrubs and now we're going to desert. So yeah, that can definitely happen, is that if we don't get plants moving in, we just get nothing growing back. And there are a lot of papers that talk about, like, we need to be like, actually going out and planting species that could exist in this new biome, like all over the place. And so that is something that you could think about doing.
Okay, let's take the question from Sophia first. Awesome work. I'm wondering how the underlying spatial treatment of vegetation in Lens 2 could be impacting the climate envelope over time. For example, a transition from tundra to boreal forest in climate envelope, but in the simulations, this region always has relatively low LAI, is tundra.
Yeah, I mean, definitely. So I think, so what Sophia is saying is totally true. So where the climate envelope is predicting boreal forest, which would definitely change the climate if that happened in our model, it's not happening in CESM. We're still saying this is tundra. And so you could say, well, the climate then is wrong. So yeah, so I think that's totally true. I think that there is definitely uncertainty related to that effect as well.
Okay, Keith.
The importance of having prognostic distribution of plant types.
Yeah.
You're analyzing Lens 2, which has prescribed.
Right.
Does that complicate the interpretation of your analysis?
Yeah,
what are your views on that?
Yeah, I think that's what Sophia was saying, right? That exactly that we are having. So this is like, if we were doing all the processes right, we would be actually simulating that the boreal forest is actually moving, and the LAI is changing, and the albedo is changing, and the latent heat flux and boundary layer, surface roughness layer is changing, but it's not in CESM in the lens, and so we're missing a potentially big climate signal, and so you have to think about these results with that in mind. And I don't know. I mean, you could probably calculate it, but but.
So along the line of the similar kind of questions, and why I guess we need to get to fates or similar, right? Is extreme years might end up being like a really important factor, and
Right.
those could be getting worse
Yeah.
than they have been, and so pushing plants, take 1 or 2 extreme years and might kill a bunch of things off.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's obvious why you kind of need to get to a TGVM. But another factor you haven't mentioned is CO2, and whether that's not folded into this at all, and
Yeah.
whether or not that could change the.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that could definitely mitigate some of the aridity changes. I don't think it would change the northern hemisphere because that's all completely driven by temperature. But I think for sure, some of the aridity driven or precip driven changes could be mitigated with elevated CO2. Yeah.
I'm wondering about the 3 variables that go into it, and I asked you about this before, but I guess I have a bit of a different question, is that, so these life zones are kind of developed in one climate where they're kind of, those variables relate to one another.
Mm-hmm.
Could you imagine that in a new climate, you've moved outside of anything that happened before, where you can have really wet and really hot
Yeah,
And then,
yeah. I mean, yeah, so, I mean, we do kind of, it does cover like a pretty big range. So like you can have really wet and really hot, but you can't have what you can't do is you can't have really high precipitation and really high temperature with really high aridity. But I don't know if that's climatically possible.
yeah, I don't know.
So I think it actually does cover like all the potential combinations, but I'm willing to be convinced otherwise.
Awesome talk, for one. It's really nice to see like ecology. It's a really different way of thinking. But I'm curious, so you brought in like this ensemble size
Yeah,
issue.
yeah.
Do you have a sense of like how many ensembles do you really need?
Oh,
Because like if you could run one long fate simulation,
yeah.
be like here, but do you actually need like 100?
I mean, I think this actually does, well, yeah. The climate space signal to noise is very high. Like, so, maybe we don't, the ensemble, because we're using annual averages, I think the uncertainty is not as big a factor as it is in maybe other studies, that have used the lens. And so, but where we do see that is obviously in the precipitation and the aridity changes. But actually that didn't lead to a ton of life zone shift changes. I mean, it changed. I mean, the climate that you're experiencing is different, right, from depending on what ensemble member, but maybe it's not enough, according to the system, enough different to make a huge difference in your life as a plant. But I have actually, I was just doing that this morning, that I've noticed that a lot of it is driven by this aridity, which is like a really strong signal most of the time. And I'm wondering if maybe I need to calculate PET in a different way, but anyway, that's beyond the scope of this talk.
Let's take the question from Will next. Ayla has been showing us for a while that we are missing changes in aridity in CSM. Does that suggest your projections are even more dire in some regions?
It depends. How is Isla calculating aridity?
I guess it's not aridity, but humidity.
Oh, humidity. I don't know. This uses humidity. The aridity incorporates humidity. So I don't know. Maybe that's where a lot of the uncertainty is coming from. I haven't looked at humidity by itself.
Yeah, you could maybe do like an upper bound calculation of you just assume that humidity doesn't increase in arid and semi-arid regions and see how that changes the answer.
Yes, I can do that.
Maybe Dan first.
So you're looking at the large ensemble and interpreting the value at a particular year as then, an uncertainty range for whether or not maybe you've crossed into a certain threshold.
Yeah.
And that uncertainty arises from stochastic internal variability.
Yeah.
My question is, to what extent these climate zones care about the particular phase of internal variability? I mean, and I guess this comes down to like, when you think about what a climate zone is, are you taking a long-term average? And then if you are, might that serve to kind of average out a lot of that internal variability?
Yeah,
And
I think,
also,
yeah.
What is the role, this gets at Dave's question too, are they really a function of the mean climate or also maybe some extremes and stuff?
Yeah, totally. I mean, originally these are supposed to be based on climate averages, and so, when I hear climate average, I want to use at least 30 years of observational data, but for this, I use the rolling 10-year average. So I already sort of am averaging out some of that variability, which is why, I wanted to reduce this interannual variability in the weather. I mean, essentially, right? But I agree. Like, I don't know what the answer to that question is. I think it matters. Like, I think I could redo this with like 30-year rolling average or 5-year or none, and see how different it is. And I mean, you do see like you do see wiggling back and forth, even in the, here we can go to this. Oh no, that does go all the way back to 1950, right? So there's like when the like main signal arises, like we are seeing at this is kind of at a transition zone. We are seeing kind of going back and forth. And so, you know, you could ask like how many years of data do you need to decide on a life zone, and how many like tundra votes do you need for you to say this is tundra, or I don't know, like, yeah.
Justin?
Just briefly, you mentioned a limitation of the resolution,
Yeah.
which I presume is about 100 kilometers.
It's a degree, yeah, 1 degree, yeah.
And there is a small ensemble of high resolution
Oh,
called Mesa clip,
okay.
and it's 25 kilometers. So I'm not sure whether that's high enough resolution to change anything.
I don't know. That's a good, thank you. I will look into that.
Dave?
Well, just following up on Deanne's these life zones, they're based on mean climates, but they could actually really be kind of sensitive to the interantral variations, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Tropics are sort of assuming there's no, but there's parts of the life space where they're sort of expecting there to be big interantral variations. So it's just not in the life zone. It's not in the Holdridge.
It's not in the Holdridge. I mean,
Which is why this is just
yeah, that
indicative,
doesn't,
right? It's
yeah, exactly. Like he was basing it on, I mean, really, it was developed in Haiti, I think, for use, but it's been applied everywhere else. But yeah, I mean, it's supposed to, like, traditionally, it should be based on like 30 years of observational data, and then you take the average and you say, oh, this is a tundra. But when we have changing climate, that's like, we can't really rely on that as much. And so, yeah, I don't know, like, how much is your life zone changing? Does that play a role into like how stressed you are? Probably. And so I think there's a lot more you could do with this. So yeah, I want to keep working on it.
Summer?
So this whole analysis was on annual means.
Yes.
So for plants, I suppose in real life, the seasonal cycle or seasonal shifts would matter a lot. So
Yeah,
when
I mean,
in
I
the
know.
region, the snowpack is in different months, the permafrost is not there. How does that come into play
In real life or
in the modeling framework?
well, here, not at all, right? We don't know anything. I mean, obviously it's all related, right? The permafrost is related to temperature change. So we can imagine if we're getting a shift northward in cool temperate forest, probably we have permafrost melt going on. But yeah, that's not being incorporated at all in this framework.
Do we have any more questions? Okay, if no, let's thank Adrianna again. Thank you everyone for coming.